Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And full disclosure, it was kind of tough to pull something together for this week. Mostly because I have been working on other things, both IRL and otherwise, pretty flat out too. Plus, it was a slow week, and the majority of what I would be covering here will not attract a ton of attention, which is always a little bit dispiriting, especially when you tack on some rather lukewarm feelings on the majority of the albums here. I mean, I hate to spoil that, but hey, if you want to stick around, let's get on the pulse. So we've got 6 albums on the docket. Let's start with, from Taemin, Never Gonna Dance Again, Act 1. Why do I get the feeling I now opened the floodgates with K-pop last week, and I'm going to wind up seeing a bunch more of it in the near future? Now anyway, Taemin is another member of SHINee, the same boy band that gave us the late Jonghyun, who I covered back in 2018. Now Taemin's been putting out solo albums since 2016, and I wish I was as impressed. He plays in a much more bouncy, dance-focused brand of pop R&B, which could call back to some older boy band traditions that I do like, but there's a jittery, trend-chasing feeling to his production and his grooves that can't quite lock in, and his filmy, lightweight vocals haven't really sold me either. If I was trying to be mean, I would call him a K-pop Zayn, or maybe having a little bit more in common with Chris Brown than he would like. That being said, if there was a project that I would recommend, it'd be his self-titled album from 2018 for having more solid songs than not. And here, well, a lot of what I just said also applies. He's following mainstream trends in pop, so of course we're gonna get the pulsating, sweeping, quasi-80s synth pop and some smoky trap flourishes, and he's considerably more convincing with the former, especially as I'm not at all impressed with his stabs at trap that they are all that distinctive. And that's before you consider how much he's trying to vamp opposite all the stuttering grooves, which can lead to some messy songs like Interpretation Waiting For, that tries to bring in some more elegant keys and even some Spanish guitar flourishes that match up with the trap percussion and the pitch shifting, and it sounds really awkward and overmixed. And it's not like his content is evolving beyond some sultry hookup jams and some flexes that, I'll be honest, might translate better if I spoke Korean, but since I don't, the translations fall a bit flat. Now, that's not saying the better pop moments aren't solid. Like most K-pop, it's overcompressed and a little thin when you look at the fine details, and I won't say that the production has as much color as it really could, but that won't kill a good hook or a good dance groove, especially when some songs they will go for the old early 2000s pop R&B boy band playbook like on Famous, and I do like that sound, but if I'm also looking for the moments that stand out or punch above, I didn't get a lot with this, so 6 out of 10 just for K-pop fans. Next up, from Doves, The Universal Want. Okay, this is an album from a band that I never expected I'd hear from again. For those of you who weren't around the 2000s, Doves is a band that got tagged with the Brit-pop bandwagon, implying for a certain quasi-anthemic brand of progressive pop rock that kind of let them dodge a lot of the scorn mainstream critics threw on prog music at the time. And I'm not sure why they got that pass, because a decade past their heyday, Doves' back catalog is fine and generally solid, but their sonic influences in progressive rock were pretty stark, and they weren't really rising above the best of what Elbow or Porcupine Tree were doing, and they didn't have the wild creativity of Muse or even the hooks of Coldplay. This was a group that was easy to like, but hard to love or remember, especially when they got more derivative. Well, anyway, this is their comeback album 10 plus years later, and it's a Doves album, alright. And one that seems focused on reminiscing on mixed connections, the universal want of everything you can't or don't have, and very specifically their strongest material around the turn of the millennium 20 years ago. And I'm stuck thinking that even when Elbow had their misfires in the past 10 to 15 years, they at least tried to innovate on their sound or write stronger hooks. It's frustrating because in terms of pure musicianship, the bass interplay and the hazy blur of guitars, they go down sound really smooth, and provided they stay away from the awkward or overemphasized drum machines, the overall sound of this album, it's pretty agreeable prog. But I gotta say it, good luck finding a sticking hook or a great melody as the album will just flop back to wallow in the haze. Again, it's fine in the background, but it's also one of those cases where I have no idea why anyone would care outside of Doves fans. And even then, they're going to be satisfied by hearing more of the same, especially when I don't think there's a dynamic or striking performance or lyrical punch that really rises above. You've heard them do this before. And incidentally, as a critic, these sorts of reunion albums pretty much give me nothing to talk about, so let's keep it short. 6 out of 10, it will satisfy the fans, be lukewarm to anybody who actually likes Turn of the Millennium prog rock, but outside of that, you won't care. Just saying. Next up from Juliet McConkey, Disappearing Girl.
On a hillside, a rose-colored ribbon unfurls.
Honestly, if there's a genre that's just running up the score in 2020, it is country. To the point where I've actually spoken to some folks honestly getting a bit tired of hearing so much of it, even if it's great stuff. Now, I'm not one of those people, so here's a debut album from Juliet McConkey. She's from rural Virginia, she moved to Texas to start refining her sound, and when I start hearing names like Jason Eady cited as some comparison points, you've got both my curiosity and my attention. Now, I'll start by saying that if you're expecting a project that's been as sunny or as crisp as Jason Eady's mixes often are, this isn't really that. The tones and arrangements are a little more rounded and full, particularly in the bass lines. They're often as robust in their arrangement as some of the guitar leads or the touches of keyboard, and some of those keyboards can often feel weirdly a bit out of tune. But the bigger coup of the arrangements are how they center McConkey as a singer. She's got the timbre similar to Brandy Clark, but maybe even a little better with her poise and command of some subtler moments. She's an absolutely terrific singer, no holds barred there, who maybe doesn't have the instant magnetism or an idiosyncratic vocal tone that you'll hear in indie country, but as a pure performer, she can really command the room. But where McConkey stands out for me, and where the comparisons with Jason Eady spring most to mind, is in a lot of her songwriting, where several of the scenes might seem deceptively simple in their construction, but they contain a lot of pathos and depth. The title of this project is not mincing words, because McConkey's storytelling often features how a woman's presence is marginalized and their strength deeply buried, where men who will just refuse to take accountability, they will run all over them and are then enabled to do so by society at large. But where things get more complex is how McConkey also highlights the women in the pictures who are not just victims, and there is some complexity in their emotional involvement with these guys, be it come from love or just a hope that something might work long term. Take a song like The Deep End, where she's talking to a musician ex of hers whose career sputtered out courtesy of what seems like drug abuse. But even here, where she could be a little bitter or petty, she tries to show some form of tenderness, or on how she will viciously criticize her own response to a homeless panhandler on I've Got a Dollar for over 6 minutes, and she does a really good job. Now granted, this is an album that absolutely takes its time, and if I got a criticism of it, it comes in the fact that many songs run long and can feel a little sleepy in some of the arrangements. I saw a comparison with Dory Freeman's work, and I think that's actually kind of apt in how I think both of them could use a little bit more energy, or maybe some arrangements with a little bit more diversity or firepower, at least once in a while on the project, especially given that McConkey has the powerful voice to pull it off. But as it is, legit great debut, and an underground name in country you'd be wise to keep your eye on. So strong 8 out of 10, make the time, give her some support. This is something special. Next up, from the Flaming Lips, American Head. man. I remember when I used to get excited for Flaming Lips albums. Yeah, the buzz around this was promising, that it was another improvement since last year, and some critics were even saying that this is their best project since the Soft Bulletin, and that the band was going back to their late 60s, early 70s psychedelic inspiration, and even Casey Musgrave showed up for a song or two. And yet, even with all that, look, I thought their release last year, King's Mouth, was pretty inessential, and I absolutely know better than to have any expectations for the Flaming Lips at this point. And all that being said, well, look, I've been very tough on their producer, Dave Fridman, the past couple of years for his bad habit of blowing out mixes and a misbegotten attempt at clunky heaviness. But the other side to that coin is that when he wants to accentuate the color and texture of a mix that's a little bit more low-key and restrained and atmospheric, he can be really damn good at it. So yeah, even though Wayne Coyne's vocals sound absolutely fried, seriously, he's a bizarre contrast opposite Casey Musgrave's sweeter delivery, and the auto-tune he's trying is not helping him. And yeah, the synths, they're always kind of bleeping and obtrusive in a way they shouldn't be, which is a bit distracting. They should be blended better. And some of the bass and percussion both still sound a little blocky because it is Dave Fridman after all. But the choice to slide back towards more vintage psychedelic rock and embrace more lush melodic textures in the guitar and swells of arranged elements, it is a really good one, and a lot of it sounds really good. It's probably the Flaming Lips' most organic and pretty sounding album they put out in a long time. And you know what? That does a little bit to amplify that nostalgic feeling of lonely stretches for connection, for lost friends or family, or even childhood nostalgia as they stretch through the mist of time and across acid-saturated minds, which to their credit, they probably reflect on more than you would expect from the Flaming Lips, especially in examining how a culture that represses reasonable drug use can further lead to an even more alienated and disillusioned youth, especially in the scenes of bloody carnage that Wayne Coyne describes, where the police have a particularly ominous presence. Telling. Timely. Now in that, it reminds me a fair bit of the disillusioned and politically adjacent anger that flooded through psychedelic rock between 1968 and 1971. And with the American backdrop, if you know that history, yeah, it wound up working a lot more for me than I thought it would. And now all that being said, it's a little bit scattered and languid, and it doesn't quite have the gut punch impact of the Terror or the varied brilliance of the Flaming Lips and their heady friends. But I will say it, this was really good, so solid 7 out of 10. If you want to get back on board, this was a good return to form to them. Nice job. Next up, from Everything Everything, Re-Animator.
Not afraid that it'll kill us yet. We are afraid that it won't.
I remember pissing a lot of people off when I described last year the one-and-done indie hype cycle in my Wise Blood review, where an act that doesn't really change or evolve their formula that much, suddenly to every music critic, this is the album you gotta pay attention to. And it's gonna make a bunch of year-end lists, and the band will finally think they've struck it big, they might even get more sales, and then for no reason, it all evaporates. All the hype goes away. And I feel sorry for the artists in that situation, because there doesn't seem to be much consistent logic behind that hype cycle, especially when their sound or style doesn't change that much. Or maybe it just becomes even more accessible going forward, but sees less attention or buzz. And I also kind of get the unfortunate feeling that this has happened to Everything Everything, and even as somebody who's been consistently lukewarm at best on this band's anxious, barely controlled art rock, I remember a lot of the hype driving Get to Heaven back in 2015, and now 5 years later, it does not seem like Re-Animator is getting much attention on a slow news week when it's not that much of a drop-off, not that much of a change. I mean, it can't be just them going to a new label, right? Because no, it's not quite as manic as Get to Heaven, but it is still Everything Everything back to their regular bag of tricks, just with heavier creaking synths and more obvious Radiohead worship. And like with Radiohead, they are back to that same thematic well, exploring a lot of mankind's tendencies toward irrationality and primal recklessness with a wonky detachment that not only kills some of that intensity, but can also feel increasingly misaligned here. A lot of this album is rooted in an exploration of the mostly debunked psychology theory of bicameralism, where half the human brain projects auditory hallucinations to the other half, perceived as voices in one's head, to which the listener can be linked to any number of things. And it's only in somewhat recent years the theory ascribes that we have recognized those inner voices as consciousness, which presumably will then bring reason along the way. And you know, I see why Everything would be intrigued by this, given their previous themes, as a loose framework and idea of why people might behave irrationally or not as civilized. But if you think it sounds kinda condescending, we haven't even gotten to the points where he makes that comparison to conspiracy theorists and those who engage in reckless capitalism, or even online trolls. I mean, maybe it's just me, but just assuming those who behave in a way that you consider irrational are mentally ill or just behind the times and haven't found consciousness yet isn't just the definition of condescending bad faith argumentation, but it's also the conflation that is shockingly ableist, especially when you seem to treat all these situations with self-obsessed musings around personal responsibility, especially on the song The Actor. It's not a good look. Now, you know what, to their credit, a lot of the framing of the album places them as characters themselves experiencing these things, and implying they're not immune to irrationality. But if you want to go to that place, you would think they would come together and coalesce to say something larger on the psychological theory. I would argue individual songs will pack more of a punch, specifically the observation on Big Climb that more people these days seem terrified of living after an apocalypse than dying within it. And deconstructing some of that nihilistic fear, that could have been fascinating. But I'll also be honest here, when you're increasingly dealing with a stiff and programmed mix where the nervous intensity is continuing to drain away, the synths and guitar tones are only getting screechier and harder to get through, and Jonathan Higgs's theatrical squawking remains a very acquired taste that I still haven't acquired, we are still stuck with an Everything project that I can appreciate in patches for interesting melodies and some okay ideas, but not for much longer. It's not just my thing. Very light 6 out of 10, probably just for the fans here, at least those that are still around. And finally, from Conway the Machine, From King to a God.
50s hit the strip and I serve it. If it's an issue, trust, I'm coming to get with you in person. With the extender throwing at you till I flip your Suburban.
So after I covered West Side Gun earlier this year, I make the promise to myself to be a little more ahead of the game when it came to other Griselda projects. Especially as I often like, but don't quite love the sound, but I see a lot of major potential for them to improve, and I want to be on board when it happens. And while I still like Benny the Butcher the most, Conway's intrigued me for being a little more of a thoughtful and layered lyricist. Still a bruiser, but willing to experiment a bit more. Yeah, if you know Griselda, going through his back catalog will not shock you in the slightest in terms of sound or content, but I did hear this new album was pushing even further, maybe even diversifying both sound and content, especially with the stable of guest features behind him with some pretty big names. And well, okay, this is an album that shows just how much potential and runway Conway has as an MC, and he's absolutely making strides, but I'm also not quite sure he's found greatness just yet. Now, I'll give him some of the same credit I give to Freddie Gibbs in being able to make gangsta rap feel more witty and layered and colorful, and you can absolutely tell the production is expanding in some of that direction too. The samples are a bit cleaner, the drums are sharper, there's a little bit more synth and grooves that are a bit more developed and bouncy, which I do see as a bit ironic given that Conway references people biting Griselda's sound as he starts to sidle into a more mainstream adjacent lane. But for as much as I appreciate the wit and sharper bars here, because this is gangster rap I will appreciate a lot more than just your bargain barrel repetitive trap, the album does have the Griselda problem, in that there's a lot of ground that's been trod before. It can start to feel a bit repetitive in terms of the gunplay, the drug running, and the flexing. I'm not saying cuts like Lemon with Method Man aren't great, but this is Conway and Griselda's comfort zone. Now, I did find myself appreciating the moments that got away from some of that and showed a little bit more insight, like how Conway reinforces his own emotional stakes by referencing his own pain at the death of friends and family who have died often on the streets. Specifically DJ Shay, whose interludes will pepper this album and add a lot of pathos. And both Seeing Everything Everything But Jesus with Freddie Gibbs and Forever Dropping Tears are both really strong cuts. Or even when he gets a little bit more political with Front Lines, highlighting police brutality and what violence is actually sanctioned by these broken systems and the racism beneath them. Hell, I actually even found myself really liking his obvious crossover cut on Z with Armani Caesar. The minimalist groove for Murda Beats is something that he can ride effortlessly, and he sounds great on it, and she sounds great too. A great Griselda signing there. But again, most of this is Conway in a very agreeable lane, but only rarely driving content or a sound that punches a bit higher. In other words, very good, has me intrigued for that second album coming if it drops this year, but I don't know, it's not quite great. Not yet for me. So, solid 7 out of 10. Check it out if you're a Griselda fan. Otherwise, still worth a listen. Give it a chance. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, I'm a little bit surprised at some of these. Again, you'll probably have comments, so leave them down there below. Happy to know how I pissed you off. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling efforts or get an album on my schedule, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, feel no obligation to do so, but if you want to, hey, there you can. Outside of all that, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.